Two of the many different rhetorical purposes that poems can achieve are to give witness or to voice protest. Poetry can achieve many different rhetorical purposes, and we've discussed several of them in the course this semester. The two that I'd like us to focus on this week are poetry that gives witness and poetry that voices protest. When a poem gives witness to something, it arrests our attention, and particularly it causes us to pay close attention to something we might otherwise overlook or miss. Poetry as witness works very hard to evoke a strong emotional response in the reader, a reaction to whatever it is the poet is holding up and asking us to see clearly. Basically, a poem that has the primary impulse of giving witness asks us to see something and not to turn away from it. Now, poetry as protest has a similar impulse, except that the goal of a protest poem is to arrest our attention with something that is unjust, inhumane, immoral, ugly in human experience. Its goal is to expose things that are objectionable, to indict inhumanity or cruelty. A protest poem wants to disturb and alarm the reader because its ultimate goal is a call to action, to try to motivate the reader to change in some way after reading the poem. So yes, a protest poem also says, see this, don't turn away, but the other goal of a protest poem is to get the reader to see him or herself in the poem, not only as a victim of whatever immoral circumstances are being depicted, but to see ourselves in the tyrant, in the criminal, in the persecutor, so that we will recognize our own failings and flaws. So when we encounter these kinds of poems, one of the ways into this poem, one of the ways to manage our emotions and not be overwhelmed by what we encounter, is to think about who the speaker is and to try to understand that speaker. So we can ask questions that will help us to understand the vantage point from which the speaker is addressing the reader, to try to understand the how this speaker imagines life, and to try to understand what conditions may have created this particular perspective or attitude in the poem's speaker. Poetry often invites us to play a kind of riddle game, a who are you game. So with respect to social identity, readers can ask ourselves this question about the poem itself and the voice that we encounter in it. Between what borders does this poem flow? What does the poem or the speaker see when it looks in a variety of directions, whether that is into the past or into the future, into the center of a situation or around the edges of that situation? There is morality at work in our poetry. And so to recognize and understand whatever moral argument the poem might be trying to make, we have to pay attention to its language. So we can think about, try to discover words that resonate with justice or beauty or truth, but also pay attention to those that evoke shame because we associate them with cruelty, hostility, violence, or deception. Now, you might argue that art reflects the prejudices and beliefs of the time in which the poem is situated and the artist who creates it. So if we accept that idea as true, and you might not, but let's say we do, I think there are some other important questions for us to ask. One might be, what are the moral obligations of the poet And if a poet has moral obligations to the world that is receiving whatever poems we create, then is it possible for us to betray our own artistic principles? So I think one way that we might betray our moral obligations as an artist is to say what is popular or palatable rather than saying what is true, what can be verified through perception and factual information. I think we can betray our moral obligations as an artist by choosing to say only what is agreeable over what is actual. I also think as artists, we betray ourselves and we betray our readers if we write by habit rather than by invention. And this is why I have challenged you to revise radically, to see what you can discover about a poem once you push past your first impressions, your first thoughts, your first ideas. And I've challenged you to resist those things that are already very familiar and cliche. If we only write according to our defaults, we write the same kind of poem over and over again, or we use the same language over and over again, we rely on the same metaphors or images over and over again, then we're limiting ourselves, but we're also asking our readers to give up their time for something that isn't really worthy of that time. Some of the poets that you might explore if you're interested in learning more about poetry that gives witness or poetry that voices protests are some of the writers listed here. We've encountered most of these in our textbook this semester. So how do we make our poetic expressions worthy of a reader's attention? Well, I think we do that by trying to discover where awe, beauty, horror, and mystery reside in the world around us. We look into those places that are often ignored by people as we bustle through our everyday lives. We can also do this by considering what problems are urgent and merit the attention of those people who have power and freedom of speech in the world. And that includes politicians and economists and preachers and teachers, but it certainly includes poets. We can ask ourselves, what do we care enough about to speak for that? Whether that is a person or a condition or an element of nature that is being crowded out and trampled. And in order to do that effectively, I think we have to be honest with ourselves about our own ignorance. What do we need to learn so that we can speak truthfully, effectively, authoritatively, and compassionately about those things that concern us? I often have to encourage young poets not to dismiss the power and uniqueness of their own voices. You have something valuable to offer to the world because your specific experiences and perspective cannot be duplicated. So you are unique, but you probably also represent some other people who might not have the abilities or the motivation to use language in the way that poetry demands. Some additional sources that can help you explore these ideas further would be a book by Helen Vendler, Poems, Poets, and Poetry. I've cited the 3rd edition here, but any edition of this particular book would help you to discover more about how poets across the centuries have articulated these two impulses. And then, of course, the Poetry Foundation website is another excellent source of information about poets who have leaned into these two impulses and to discover a deep well of poetry that accomplishes this task.